Hello, and welcome to the Story Strategy Podcast from Evident Inc. This is episode 65, and today we are going to be talking all about tropes. We have done trope episodes in the past, focusing specifically on romance and how to use romance tropes, but I wanted to open the aperture a little bit today and talk a little bit more broadly about what tropes are and how we can use them to our advantage as writers, but in the bigger sense as storytellers. So we will get there in just a moment. First, I just wanted to say hello and pop through a little personal news segment. As you know, I write as Delancey Stewart, and there has just been a whole smattering. Is that a lot? A smattering is probably not a lot. There's been a tidal wave, that's a lot, of writerly crap going on. This weekend I did a local author showcase here where I live in Colorado, and that's always fun because you get to meet other writers working in the local area. I in my experience, those tend to bring kind of some new writers, and that's always exciting. So I think I was not the oldest, but the most experienced author there. So I got to talk with some of the other authors about publishing and just all the stuff I talk about on this podcast. So it was really fun. And I'm beginning to realize in my somewhat older age that maybe that's where I am most comfortable. I love writing and I'm not going to stop. I will always be Delancey, but I really love coaching and helping other authors find their voice and figure out how to weasel their way through this crazy indie publishing market that we've built. And so I was really in my happy place. And the coolest thing about it was that my youngest son, who we called Lunchbox, went with me and acted as my assistant. He's never seen me as Delancey before. And so he just, I think, thought it was hilarious because Delancey smiles constantly and is far more friendly than I am. Not that I'm not friendly, but I've always been a little bit shy, I guess. And Delancey is everything that I would be if I didn't have any social insecurity whatsoever. She is fun and outgoing and extroverted. And so I think it was kind of interesting for him to see me be Delancey. And it was good practice for me because we have Readers Take Denver coming up in a few weeks. And this, I think, had about 50 guests show up. Readers Take Denver has thousands, and I am by far the smallest fish. Well, one of the smaller fish in the sea. There's going to be like the woman who wrote the Suki Stackhouse books that got made into True Blood, the miniseries. Charlene Harris is going to be there. And Rebecca Yaros, who wrote, obviously, Fourth Wing, is going to be there. A million huge people. And I am obviously just me, just Delancey. I have a lot of pre-orders, so I know I'm going to see a ton of readers, and I'm excited about that. And my faithful friend / assistant, who I always call the organized side of my brain, Kelly, is going to come, and we're going to get to hang out in person, which we never do because she does not live in Colorado. But we spend a lot of time together online, so it's always fun when we get to see each other in real life. Plus, I'll get to, hang out with some other authors who I love, and that's one of the best things about this world that we have built is the writing community that we are a part of, and especially romance. It's just such a great giving group of people, and every time I get to hang out with other authors, I have such a great time, and I always learn something. So look forward to the recap from Readers Take Denver. That's at the end of April. But today, let's dive in. Oh, sorry, writing news. Yes, I'm always writing. I don't want to say stuck. I'm not stuck. I actually know exactly where I'm going, but I'm writing Puck Proposal, which is the third book in the Wilcox Wombat series, formerly called the Zamboni Diaries, but we don't call it that because of the cease and desist letter that I received from the Zamboni Company. Who knew that was a trademark name? Probably everyone but me. Anyway, nothing going on there. Everything is fine. I am not being sued. Yay. But I am writing the third book in that series, which is A Marriage of Convenience, Second Chance romance that I am having a ball writing, especially because there's a cat in it. I don't know why. I just really have fun writing animals. Just be glad there's not an actual wombat in it. But I am behind schedule and I hate that. So I have to finish it. It was supposed to be done Monday to give to Dawn Alexander. She just texted me and said, hey, I won't be able to look at it until the 25th anyway, which gives me a whole nother week. So I was like, oh, well, gosh, that's too bad. No, I was like, that is a huge relief. Okay. So that's what's going on with me. As soon as I am done recording this, I'm going to have to dive into the writing cave, which lately has looked a lot like a coffee shop down in downtown. I just have to get away from the house and the people and the things and the dog and the stuff in order to really focus. And all I need is a few hours to get 3,000 to 5,000 words. And if I do that every day, guess what? I have a book. So it's just a little bit of self-discipline, and I will be doing that as soon as we're done here. So let's talk about tropes. There are two different ways that you can use the word trope, or three if you include the way that my husband uses it, which is pretty much to describe absolutely anything. And it drives me insane because I wish I had never mentioned the word to him, but he lives with a romance writer, so he knows what a trope is, kind of. Anyway, trope is a word that gets used to describe a creative way of saying something. So a metaphor or a simile, those are tropes. Let's see, I wrote it down, a figurative or metaphorical use of a word or expression. And then the way that we talk about tropes typically is in storytelling. It's a convention. A trope is a storytelling convention. But these two things are super related. And if you think about Romeo looking out the window and saying, what light yonder window, blah, 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 it's Juliet. Or it's in the east and Juliet is the sun. That's what he says. Juliet is the sun. That's a metaphor, right? It's basically these types of tropes, when we're talking about metaphors, etc., are used to relieve us from boring language. And I think that that is not a lot different from the way that we use tropes as storytelling conventions. If we apply a little bit of writerly freedom to the way that we use tropes. And what I mean by that is twisting them a bit so that the same familiar situations that get used over and over become slightly fresh and unfamiliar in the hands of a good storyteller. And we'll dig a little deeper into how we use tropes and how to twist them in just a bit. But first, I wanted to talk about why we use tropes. What do they do for us? Remember, I said that in the sort of Juliet is the sun example, it's a way to get us to say something in a more interesting way to escape boring language. It sounds like a contradiction because the reason that we use tropes as storytelling conventions is partially to create familiar situations for readers. So let's dig into that a little bit. A storytelling convention or a trope, which you're going to hear me say this word 90,000 times probably in the next half hour, tells your readers or your listeners or whatever medium you're using to tell your story, it tells them in a sense what they're going to get. So you hear me talk a lot about, for instance, in last week's marketing episode, I talked about comps and how we need to identify where we fit in the market. This is similar because the end game always is your audience. You are telling a story to a specific person or a specific group of people. And in order for them to find you and to know that they want to hear your story or read your story, they have to have some at least vague notion of what your story will be about. So that is why making sure you're on the right shelf in the bookstore is important. But it is also why we want to be pretty clear about what our story is about. And tropes are one way that help us tell that, that little synopsis. You'll notice if you dig through the blurbs that you can find on any retailer site, that they are just stuffed, jam-packed with tropes, hopefully, because that is what cues readers, ooh, I really like this story. For instance, I read a ton of thrillers. I love a psychological thriller, a domestic suspense. I am less big on serial killers. and police procedurals. I don't love all of that stuff. I like the family drama / thriller. So I can tell when I read a blurb that if it mentions a serial killer or a policeman, I'm a lot less interested in that. And those are tropes. Those are the cues that tell me whether I'm going to enjoy this book or not. And I, as a thriller reader, go out specifically searching for specific tropes that I know I enjoy. Romance readers are absolutely the kings and queens of this. They know exactly what they like. Most of them will read outside their favorite tropes and try new things, but that doesn't change the fact that most romance readers, especially our whale readers, will read the same trope over and over as many times as they can get their hands on it. So in essence, tropes tell us what we're getting in the story. They make us comfortable, right? They give us a sense of familiarity. So there are super common tropes across all genres. Romance is known for tropes, but you'll find them anywhere. So for example, in sci-fi, bad robots, like for instance, iRobot, right? AI that's too smart, or technology that has taken over. Like think about, I may be older than everyone listening to this, but Shut the Pod Bay Doors, Hal. Remember? Is it 2001, A Space Odyssey, where the AI gets too smart and becomes sentient? And that's a totally typical, very common sci-fi trope, right? What are some others? Everything is a simulation. Think about the Matrix. There's an evil empire. Oh, hello, Star Wars. So these are super common tropes. Think about The One, right? That gets blended into everything from fantasy commonly to sci-fi, where Neo, right, is the one. Luke Skywalker is the one. There's one person who usually thinks they're totally a regular guy or girl who finds out that they're the one. Harry Potter, for instance. That is a trope. So let's look at mystery. What about Everybody's Guilty? Think about Murder on the Orient Express, right? Everyone's a suspect. Other tropes that are less plot-based and more kind of setup-based are things like female sleuth or amateur sleuth. If you look at all the cozy mysteries, you get an antique stealer or a grandmother, or, look at Murder, She Wrote. I don't remember. Was she a journalist, like a newspaper person? At any rate, those are tropes in mystery. And in thrillers, it's the spouse, or it's the mentor who we thought was a good guy, but is actually a bad guy. A bad cop is a trope. So these are all the types of things that storytellers rely on in order to convey to their audience, hey, you're going to like this story because you love stories with bad cops. That tells us what to expect. And we're basically suggesting what our promise is as we write our synopsis or our blurb. We're explaining to the audience what it is we're promising them, right? It's just like the wrapper on the outside of a cookie or a candy bar. You want to know what's inside before you get in there and take a bite. And that is what tropes do for us. So in romance, interestingly, an author named Cindy Dees has published a few books lately, and I'm guessing there are going to be 2 more coming, where she breaks up tropes into 4 categories. And I had never thought about it quite like this before. I'm not 100% sure that I agree, but these are big, thick books. She has found a lot to talk about, and I haven't read them completely yet. I have the first 2 here, but she breaks them up into internal, external, backstory tropes, and hook tropes, which I thought was interesting, because what she uses as internal tropes a lot of times, and backstory tropes, are like wounds. And here, I'll read what her explanations are of those 4 different kinds of tropes. She says that internal tropes are the tropes of personal affliction. So what I typically call wounds, when we are writing romance. They're also the filters that I talked about in the Deep POV episode we did recently. So she says these are the tropes of personal affliction, the wounds, fears, and personality traits that form obstacles to love inside the hearts and minds of your story's hero and heroine. So that's internal tropes, according to Cindy in this great book. External tropes are comprised of people, situations, and problems that prevent them from blissfully and naturally falling in love and finding their happily ever after. So I think this external trope is what we commonly think of as tropes. Things like enemies to lovers. She's almost using this in the same way that we use external conflict, which often sits side by side with tropes. Workplace is one of these that often is a trope, but brings you a conflict at the same time. So I think that's what she means by external tropes. Backstory tropes, she says, as the name implies, these are made up of lingering problems, scars, and needs from your hero and heroine's pasts that must be overcome before they can achieve happiness and true love. In my mind, these are going to be very similar to the internal tropes, the wounds, fears, and personality traits, because wounds and fears and personality traits come from our history, right? They don't just erupt out of nowhere inside of us. They are born from our experience. So it will be interesting when the backstory trope book comes out to see how those differ from internal tropes in Cindy Dees's mind. And then lastly, she has one called hook tropes, which she also says can be called inciting incident tropes, which are the trope-based way that our hero and heroine might meet. So things like, you can look at that workplace romance one again, they meet at work. So that could be considered an inciting incident trope. I don't know that I want to break them down quite to that degree. And I have a feeling there's going to be a significant amount of overlap in the way that she talks about these. But if you are looking for guides to tropes to really understand, I'm guessing these very dense books are going to tell you everything you need to know. I will be reading them. I have not read them quite yet, but I have skimmed them, and there is just a ton in here. So good job, Cindy Dees, and thank you for this awesome resource. I would love to chat with her at some point in the future, maybe on our podcast. But for now, let's dive a little bit into romance tropes. We'll talk a little bit about what some of them are, and then we'll talk about how to avoid the thing that I think everyone worries about when we start talking about tropes. And that is, how do we stop ourselves from becoming cliche? How do we keep our story fresh and interesting if we are relying on a trope or two or three or four? I wanted to mention category romance as sort of a way to move into this conversation, because when I first was writing and I had an agent, and she was kind of guiding me through how to write a romance, because I was new. She suggested that I maybe start by writing category romances. And at the time, I said, oh, okay, good idea. I didn't know what the hell a category romance was. I was brand stinking new. So I had to do a lot of digging around because I didn't want to ask her either. So there's a lesson in that. Your agent works for you. So if you have questions, ask the questions. Don't be me. I instead treated my first agent like a mentor or an oracle or something. And like, I was so lucky to have her. And I was, but also I did not acknowledge the fact that technically she made money when I made money. Like, she was my employee. A great woman, still love her, really appreciate her advice. But I have veered off wildly into a whole different direction. If you are looking for an agent, please keep in mind that you are the employer in that situation. And that is all I will say about that. So back to category romance. When I dug into it, what I figured out, and what you probably already know because everyone knows more than me about everything, okay, not true, is that the category romances are series or lines published by traditional publishers, typically in romance, that focus specifically on things like medical romance or firefighter romance. In a way, they are lines of books that are specifically dedicated to a single trope or to a single setup. And then when you read the descriptions of what they're looking for submissions, they often say a minimum of 3 tropes or a minimum of 2 tropes. So it is very common to blend tropes together. And I think you'll find that you are doing that without even doing it intentionally, but I recommend being intentional about the way that you employ tropes when you are building a story. For instance, you could set up a workplace romance with a military hero. That's 2 tropes. You could bring in enemies to lovers, 3 tropes. You could make it a second chance romance because they knew each other in elementary school. That's 4 tropes. And throw in an accidental pregnancy. 5 tropes, all in one book, right? And what's cool about tropes is that each of those that I mentioned pretty much dictates at least one scene where you are setting up what that trope is, right? And how those characters behave and interact as a result of the setup that you've given them. So you could put those 5 tropes together in a way that no one else has ever done, and it will be completely fresh. But that is how you can build a story with more than one trope fairly easily, right? So how do you avoid making your story appear formulaic when you're using tropes? For one thing, don't forget that readers come to tropes for specific reasons. They come because they know they like that trope. So you don't want to make it unrecognizable. You just want to make it fresh, right? You don't have to do never been done before. As I think I've said lots and lots of times, there is no never been done before. Um, Humans have been telling stories for millennia, and there is a reason that we come back to the same stories, and that is because they define our world. Storytelling is ridiculously important. Don't forget that. And tropes are one of the ways that we can identify which kinds of stories we want to be told. So remember that your trope defines your reader expectations and follows familiar lines, and that most tropes contain an innate conflict that will drive your plot. If you think about tropes like alien invasion, secret baby, love triangle, these all contain an innate conflict, right? And so tropes are super useful if you're not a plotter, or even if you are, because they steer you in one direction or another. You kind of know to some degree where you need to go. Um, that doesn't mean that you have to write them exactly the same way every time. Think of your tropes as scaffolding. Think of them as the foundation inside of your story building. And then the way that you build around your tropes, you can go Art Deco, you can do craftsman, you can go ultra modern. You can build the actual building in lots of different ways. But that foundation is what your readers are going to recognize. And that's the thing that you want to hang everything else around. So let's talk about if we're using familiar tropes, how do we keep our stories fresh and intriguing? And there's a couple different ways. Number one, the conflict. So if you are using a familiar trope, you may want to twist up the conflict that goes with it. For instance, if you are using a billionaire trope, say it's a marriage auction, right? The billionaire bids on the potential spouse for whatever reason. So that's where you can change things up a little bit. Make your reason fresh. Make your billionaire a woman. Is she bidding on a man? Make the man's reasons for participating in a spouse auction different than anything you have read before. The things that hang around the trope are the things that you can affect and make your story really interesting and fresh. So an example, if you've ever seen a movie where there's a workaholic and an intern, and the intern is some fresh young ingenue who makes the workaholic see the error of his ways and take more time off, enjoy life more. So that's a pretty common, especially traditional trope where the woman is the breath of fresh air that comes in and makes the working man see that there's more to life. So go watch the movie The Intern with Anne Hathaway and Robert De Niro. Completely flips that upside down. Anne Hathaway is the workaholic. She's young, she's beautiful. Robert De Niro is like an old retired guy, and he ends up being her intern, and it is just adorable and brilliant. It's a fun movie, and there's also a second chance romance story that kind of runs parallel in there, and great movie. So if you're looking for kind of an example of how to make a trope fresh, that's a good one. Here's another one you might not think about. Shrek. So what tropes are we looking at there? There's an ugly duckling story, remember, because the female ogre at night turns into a human, and she's so embarrassed because the human is hideous, right? She's this princess. No, the truth is that she turns into an ogre, but the ogre version of her is the one that is falling in love. And so the ugly duckling story is actually reversed because the human is the ugly duckling, right? And I love that our prince is an ogre, and that's a great flip on that very traditional fairy tale story. Other ways that you can sort of mix things up. There's a really interesting, when I was doing research for this, there's a really interesting character archetype that has kind of evolved in the past, 20, 30 years. And they call it I didn't write it down, the manic pixie dream girl. And this is a character who is usually contrasted with a young male protagonist who is brooding and dark and focused on his, internal conflict. And this manic pixie dream girl character is thrown up against him to basically disrupt his darkness and show him she's usually super quirky. Maybe she dresses differently than all the other girls. She's independent, doesn't care what people think. You can probably think of 90 examples of this girl. So using like a guy character in this way would be one way to flip up that trope a little bit. I think that romance has taken that manic pixie dream girl and used her a lot in the grumpy sunshine trope, where we've got, our dude going about his normal life, doesn't need love, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden there's this crazy, fun, bright, sunshiny woman that's thrown in his path, and he realizes all the things he's been missing out on. So we use it too. It gets used in sci-fi a lot. Some of the examples I found of it were like Dharma in Dharma and Greg, or I hadn't seen a lot of the movies that they mentioned. Sam in Garden State, it's Natalie Portman, or I think even Phoebe in Friends, or Lily in How I Met Your Mother. Kind of give you that quirky female energy that mixes things up. So I suggest bring us a guy instead. Other ways you could do it, make the woman the billionaire, make the woman the big mafia head. Tell us the bad guy's story. Think about Maleficent and Wicked. Suddenly you are sympathetic for the bad guy. Or think about how the bad guy turns out to be the good guy. Maybe this person who has been cast in the role of the antagonist the whole time has been working for the good of our hero and heroine. Or maybe a mentor turns out to have been the antagonist all the way along. There's lots of thriller twists, and you can find lists of them online, that work equally well in romance, where you can take a third party, not the hero or heroine, but give them an interesting twist, and suddenly you've got a fresh take on an old story. So I recommend really digging into the tropes that you love and thinking about how you can make them fresh. What if, like in an enemies to lovers story, there's actually a third force that is the real enemy, and so our enemies end up working together? Or a second chance romance. So these people have known each other in the past, but what if one of them is actually the twin of the person that they actually knew in the past? There's all kinds of ways to take the reader loved familiar tropes and just tweak them a little bit to give your story a brand new life, and give readers something that, while comforting and familiar, is also something they didn't quite expect. And those are the stories that really take off. Those are the ones that people talk about. So I encourage you to make a list of your favorite tropes and then really challenge yourself to figure out how can you twist it? How can you make it new? And I would love to hear examples that you guys can think of books that have done this well or movies that have done this really well. You're welcome to email me, Nancy at evidentinc.com, or reply in comments to this, or come submit a form on our website. However you want to tell me, I would love to hear about it. Go to our Facebook page and let's chat, because this is one of my absolute favorite topics. And I think that there's just so much room to experiment with something that people tend to think is cliche. And I challenge you to prove that tropes are not cliches. They are very useful storytelling tools. And when put in the hands of a skillful wielder, can really create something unusual and different. So that's what I'm going to leave you with today. Go out and trope. As always, if you need us, we are here. Thanks so much, and I hope to see you soon.
You can find story writing tips, tricks, coaching, and courses at our site, www.evidentinc.com. Get live feedback in our writing community at facebook.com/evidentinc, and find past episodes of Story Strategy at our YouTube channel. Story powers the world, and we can't wait to help you tell yours.